As President Donald Trump announced a 50% tariff on copper pipes and wiring, set to take effect the following day, it was clear that the rhetoric surrounding trade wars was reaching new levels of intensity. With the deadline fast approaching, Trump's declaration seemed to signal yet another flare-up in the ongoing trade tensions between the U.S. and Canada. The move was ostensibly justified on national security grounds, but the reasoning felt shaky. After all, no direct threat had been cited related to copper, a crucial industrial material with broad applications in sectors ranging from home construction to electric vehicle manufacturing. Still, the optics of Trump's declaration were designed to unsettle. By setting a hard deadline of August 1st, Trump sought to apply pressure, hoping to spur Canada into making concessions in the ongoing trade negotiations. The Canadian response, however, was far from what Trump might have hoped. Despite the high drama of the tariff announcement, Ottawa did not react with the urgency expected. No midnight cabinet meetings were called, no emergency press conferences convened. Instead, the reaction from Canadian policymakers, particularly from Mark Carney, the former Bank of Canada governor and then advisor to the government, was a calm and calculated silence. Behind the scenes, Carney and his team had already prepared for such eventualities, understanding that Trump's tactics were more about exerting control than seeking genuine negotiation. The tariff itself, though headline-grabbing, wasn't as catastrophic for Canada as it seemed at first glance. The key distinction lay in the nature of the copper products affected by the tariff. While the U.S. would be imposing the 50% penalty on semi-finished copper goods like pipes, rods, and tubes, Canadian exports were largely comprised of raw copper materials, cathodes, concentrates, and anodes, that fell outside the tariff's scope. For Canadian copper producers, the feared economic fallout never materialized. In fact, the tariff, which was supposed to shake up the Canadian industry, was largely irrelevant to their business model. They'd already shifted much of their production away from the U.S. market in anticipation of such disruptions. Far from sending shockwaves through the Canadian sector, the tariff provided a moment of quiet relief. This level-headed response was no accident. Carney, ever the strategist, had long understood that Trump's approach to trade was volatile and unpredictable. The U.S. president had a reputation for making dramatic, often chaotic moves, yet the Canadian response was marked by restraint and preparation. The message was clear: Canada would not be rushed into a reactionary stance. In fact, Carney's refusal to panic underscored a broader shift in the way Canada was positioning itself in relation to its southern neighbor. Mark Carney's approach wasn't just about managing tariffs or negotiating trade deals in the moment. It was about long-term strategy. He knew that Canada's trade dependence on the U.S. had to evolve, that relying on reactive strategies would no longer suffice. While Washington was caught up in the tactical game of deadlines and tariffs, Carney and his team were already planning the future by quietly diversifying Canada's trade routes and reducing reliance on U.S. supply chains. For Carney, the tariff was not the crisis it appeared to be. It was an opportunity to underscore the shift toward a more resilient and autonomous Canadian trade strategy. For many in Ottawa, the tariff served as a reminder of how Trump's unpredictability had become a core feature of American diplomacy. In the words of Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who famously remarked on Trump's capriciousness, "The cheese slips off the cracker, the frustration was palpable." Ford's words, though casual, encapsulated a growing sentiment among Canadian leaders. How do you deal with a partner whose next move is never clear? Ford's metaphor wasn't just about Trump's unpredictability, it was about risk. How can a country build long-term industrial strategies when the rules of engagement change without warning? While Ford's frustration may have seemed emotional, it also reflected a deeper, more pragmatic shift in Canadian policy. As unpredictable as Trump's trade tactics were, Carney had begun to formulate a clear path forward. With each erratic move from Washington, Carney's calm and deliberate strategy grew stronger. He wasn't engaging in back-and-forth exchanges of tariffs and threats. Instead, he was letting the chaos unfold while Canada solidified its own position, quietly distancing itself from the fluctuating whims of U.S. trade policy. As the August 1st deadline loomed, the tensions surrounding the U.S. Canada trade talks reached a fever pitch. President Trump had insisted that the date marked an unmovable deadline, a final line in the sand for any negotiations, yet the very concept of a deadline was starting to unravel. While the U.S. loudly heralded the approach of August 1st as critical and non-negotiable, Mark Carney, for his part, refused to let Washington dictate the terms of engagement. In fact, he was deliberately disengaging from the urgency that Trump sought to impose. Carney wasn't just passively waiting out the deadline, he was actively reshaping Canada's approach to the negotiations. For Carney, the concept of time and trade negotiations had always been flexible. The clock on Washington's self-imposed deadline was ticking faster for the U.S. than it was for Canada. While the Trump administration frantically positioned itself in front of a clock it had constructed, Carney quietly worked to move Canada beyond it. The longer Trump stuck to a hard timeline, the more out of step he became with Canada's evolving strategy. While the U.S. placed pressure on its trading partners with the threat of tariffs and unilateral deadlines, Carney's approach was grounded in a different understanding of power dynamics, a longer-term perspective that didn't revolve around a ticking clock. In the wake of the tariff announcement, Carney reframed the entire negotiation. While the U.S. had insisted on a quick resolution, Carney's calm demeanor sent a powerful message. Canada would not be rushed. There was no sense of panic in Ottawa, no frantic scramble to meet an arbitrary deadline. Rather, Carney's refusal to bend under pressure turned the pressure itself into an advantage. The strength of the Canadian position lay not in its willingness to accept or reject every demand from the U.S., but in its ability to maintain a steady course while Washington floundered with its own chaotic signaling. The true brilliance of Carney's strategy was in how he absorbed the shockwaves from Washington while never allowing those disturbances to alter Canada's fundamental trajectory. By sticking to a steady long-term plan, Carney was positioning Canada to operate in a world where trade deals didn't depend on the unpredictable whims of the White House. At the heart of this was a simple but profound realization. The urgency that Trump sought to impose was a tool designed to force concessions, but it only worked when the other side felt cornered. Canada, Carney understood, wasn't in a corner. It had been slowly and steadily repositioning itself for just this moment. In contrast, the U.S. seemed to be thrashing, confused by the very deadline it had set. While Canada was positioning itself with a cool-headed long-term plan, Washington's internal confusion grew more apparent by the day. Questions emerged about the very nature of the deadline. Was it real? Was it negotiable? Was it meant to be flexible or fixed? These contradictions became all the more apparent as trade officials from the U.S. sent conflicting messages, undermining the very foundation of the leverage they hoped to use. Carney's position, in contrast, became increasingly clear. While Trump's administration scrambled to enforce a hard line, Canada was moving beyond the clock altogether. In the midst of all this, Carney's signal to Canada was quiet yet firm. There would be no rush. This wasn't about dragging out negotiations for the sake of it. It was about resisting pressure and ensuring that Canada wasn't forced into a corner by arbitrary deadlines and poorly thought-out tariffs. By staying silent, by not reacting to every rhetorical move from the U.S., Carney was making the statement that Canada could afford to wait. The time for a deal on Canada's terms would come, if it came at all. It was around this time that Carney's approach gained broader validation. Across Canada, leaders from different political backgrounds began to coalesce around a growing consensus. Trump's trade tactics were volatile, and Canada needed to prepare for a future in which its economic strategy was less dependent on U.S. whims. And while some may have criticized Carney for delaying or for being too cautious, those same voices began to acknowledge the quiet genius of his long game. Every day that passed without a deal in Washington allowed Canada to build more resilience into its domestic economy and trade networks. Even within the provinces, leaders began to take action on their own. In private, Canadian officials accelerated efforts to diversify trade partnerships. New markets in Asia were explored, while logistical frameworks for future exports to Europe were revamped. Carney's strategy didn't simply involve waiting for the right moment. It was about laying the groundwork for Canada to operate more independently on the global stage. No matter what happened in Washington, Canada was already preparing for a future that didn't hinge on U.S. trade deals. As the days ticked down to August 1st, the stage seemed set for a dramatic climax in the U.S. Canada trade standoff. But what unfolded was anything but a final showdown. The anticipated diplomatic clashes never materialized, and instead, the silence from Ottawa became the loudest message of all. While President Trump's administration was scrambling, trying to manage an increasingly chaotic narrative, Mark Carney's deliberate calm became the foundation upon which a new Canadian strategy was built. By refusing to respond to Washington's unrelenting pressure, Carney effectively shifted the power dynamic. As U.S. officials staked their reputation on the need for an urgent resolution, Carney's refusal to play into that urgency allowed Canada to work from a position of relative stability. While Trump played a game of high stakes, Carney was redefining the rules. And though it would be easy to view this period as one of stagnation or inaction, Carney's leadership was anything but passive. It was an exercise in strategic patience. The next step in the unfolding drama came when the U.S. placed the issue of Palestinian statehood at the forefront of the talks. Trump's administration had framed Canada's recognition of Palestine as an obstacle to progress. Yet even in the face of this new challenge, Carney didn't escalate or react sharply. Instead, Trump's rhetoric wavered. Initially framed as a major setback, the importance of this issue quickly diminished when Trump himself hesitated, signaling a lack of clarity about whether it would derail the talks altogether. For Carney, this moment was more than just a diplomatic exchange. It exposed the fundamental inconsistency in Trump's strategy. Trump's public contradictions, where he first sought to punish Canada diplomatically and then walked back his position, underscored the central problem, the unpredictability of his administration. Trump's message was incoherent, and it became clear that the U.S. was caught in a trap of its own making. Carney had no need to argue or respond forcefully. He simply needed to wait. The U.S. was cornering itself with its own contradictions, and Canada, through Carney's steady hand, was choosing to remain outside the chaotic cycle. This moment also illustrated something deeper at play. While Trump was trying to leverage geopolitical issues like Palestinian statehood to gain an advantage in trade negotiations, Carney was reshaping the conversation around Canada's future. The stakes were no longer just about tariffs or trade quotas. The conversation was about Canada's long-term positioning in a world where the U.S. no longer held the same central role in trade agreements. Carney had been subtly shifting Canada's alliances over the course of months, aligning more closely with European nations and multilateral trade agreements, while pulling back from a dependence on the U.S. market. Canada wasn't simply resisting Trump's immediate pressures, it was strategically decoupling itself from U.S. economic volatility. In Carney's hands, this wasn't a reckless departure, it was a careful redefinition of Canada's place in the global economic order. By quietly aligning with European norms and multilateral trade frameworks, Canada was signaling that it would no longer be a bystander in a system dominated by American interests. This quiet pivot was a declaration. Canada would not be pushed into submission by deadlines, tariffs, or shifting policy whims. As the U.S. increasingly turned its focus elsewhere, with Trump's public statement that Canada was no longer a priority in trade negotiations, the landscape shifted once more. Trump's words, though meant to convey strength, were actually an admission of retreat. The president, who had once promised a dramatic overhaul of NAFTA, now acknowledged that Canada was no longer central to his plans. For Carney, this was not a loss. It was a win. By allowing Trump to walk away from the table, Carney freed Canada from the cycle of reactive trade negotiations that had dominated U.S. Canada relations for decades. While Trump's disengagement from Canada was painted as indifference, Carney understood it for what it truly was, an opportunity for Canada to start charting its own course. No longer bound by the constant threat of tariffs or the looming deadline, Carney could now focus on shaping a future that didn't rely on the whims of Washington. In many ways, Canada was no longer at the mercy of American trade policy. It was taking back control of its own economic future. In the months that followed, the Canadian government quietly pushed forward with plans to diversify trade routes and reduce reliance on the U.S. market. Asian markets for agricultural products were explored in earnest, while the European Union became a stronger partner for Canadian trade. What was once a reactive approach, dictated by Washington's actions, had now shifted to one of proactive strategic planning. Canada was building insulation, reinforcing its trade policies from the ground up. By taking a step back and allowing Trump's disarray to run its course, Carney had given Canada the space to make long-term decisions without the pressure of last-minute deals or shifting tariffs. The quiet brilliance of Carney's strategy was now evident. Canada was no longer negotiating under duress. It was forging its own path, gradually and deliberately pulling away from a system where it had been tethered too long to the unpredictable policy swings of its southern neighbor. The Canadian government, under Carney's quiet leadership, was not simply biding its time, it was building a new, more resilient trade future. In this reshaped landscape, Carney had also provided the groundwork for Canada's future in the global trade order. As the U.S. increasingly became consumed by internal chaos and international isolation, Canada had already taken steps to align itself with a broader coalition of democratic economies. By focusing on multilateral trade agreements and rethinking its economic ties, Canada had positioned itself as a key player in the evolving global economy, no longer relying on the U.S. as its only anchor. Through strategic restraint, Carney had done what many thought impossible. He had rewritten the terms of Canada's relationship with the United States without firing a single shot in the trade wars. No dramatic speeches, no aggressive tariffs, just quiet, deliberate action that set Canada on a course toward a future defined on its own terms. Trump, the self-styled dealmaker, may have thought he had cornered Canada, but in the end it was Carney's quiet mastery of the long game that would define this moment in Canadian economic history. As the dust settled, it became clear Canada wasn't just surviving the trade war, it was thriving beyond it, with a stronger sense of autonomy and an emerging role in a new world order.